A routine stop turns unthinkable. The streets of Brookhaven shimmered under the glow of streetlights as Judge Adam Rahman drove home after a long, grueling day in court. The weight of his robe had been shed hours ago, left draped over the chair in his chambers. In its place, he wore a simple button-up shirt and slacks, ordinary clothes that stripped him of the authority he carried inside the courtroom. The traffic was light, the roads calm, and the air carried the faint hum of the city settling into the night. It was supposed to be an uneventful drive, a quiet moment of reflection before he reached the comfort of his home. Then the flash of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. A police cruiser trailed him, its siren silent but its presence deafening. Judge Rahman's brows furrowed. He knew he hadn't violated any traffic laws. His speed was steady, his turn signals used properly, and he hadn't touched his phone. Still, years in the courtroom had taught him never to assume. With a steady hand, he signaled and pulled over to the curb. The patrol car followed suit, its headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Inside his vehicle, Rahman took a breath. He had ruled over countless cases involving law enforcement, had given officers the benefit of the doubt in close-call situations. He believed in the system. But in that moment, as he watched the silhouette of the officer approaching in his side mirror, a strange unease settled in his chest. The officer, tall, rigid in posture, tapped on the driver's side window with the edge of his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior of Rahman's car. Slowly, Rahman rolled down the window, greeting the officer with a calm but firm tone. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer's face remained impassive. He was young, mid-30s, maybe, with sharp blue eyes that flicked across Rahman's face, scanning, assessing. "License and registration," the officer said, ignoring the question. Rahman nodded, reaching for his wallet with deliberate, unhurried movements. He had seen too many cases where minor gestures were misinterpreted as threats. As he handed over his documents, he finally caught the officer's name, J. Miller. Miller barely glanced at the paperwork before shifting his attention back to Rahman. There was something unnerving about his silence, the way his fingers lingered near the holster of his gun. "Any reason for the stop, Officer Miller?" Rahman asked again. Miller's jaw tensed. "Step out of the vehicle." Rahman's brows furrowed. "Excuse me. You heard me. Step out of the car." A spark of irritation flickered in Rahman's chest, but he kept his voice level. "Officer, I don't believe I've done anything wrong. I'd like to know the reason for this request before I—" Miller's hand moved, not to his gun, but close enough to send a message. His tone sharpened. "Step out. Now." Rahman exhaled slowly. Years of upholding justice had taught him patience, but something about this moment felt different. He wasn't being treated like a citizen. He was being treated like a suspect. He unclipped his seatbelt and stepped out onto the pavement, the night air suddenly colder than before. Miller stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he took in Rahman's features. Hands on the car. A beat of silence passed. "Is there a reason for—" Miller grabbed Rahman's wrist and spun him around, pressing him against the hood of the car. The roughness of the movement knocked the breath from his lungs. "Hey, what's the charge?" Rahman demanded, his voice still steady but laced with disbelief. Miller ignored him. The cold steel of handcuffs closed around his wrists. For the first time in his life, Judge Adam Rahman, the man who had spent decades upholding the law, was no longer a protector of justice. He was a victim of it. And the system he believed in had just turned against him. The man behind the badge. Judge Adam Rahman had seen injustice before. He had ruled over cases of wrongful arrests, of lives upended by hasty decisions and unchecked power. But never in his life had he imagined he would be on the receiving end of such a miscarriage of justice. His pulse pounded in his ears as the cold metal of the handcuffs pressed against his skin. The flashing red and blue lights of the patrol car reflected in the side mirror, casting distorted patterns across his face. His mind raced, trying to piece together the reasoning behind Officer Miller's actions. "Officer," he tried again, keeping his voice measured, "I am a sitting judge. You are making a mistake." Miller scoffed. "Yeah, and I'm the commissioner." Rahman closed his eyes for a brief moment, exhaling through his nose. He had spent years advocating for fair treatment, for the idea that justice should be blind to personal biases. But in this moment, justice wasn't blind. It was willfully ignorant. Miller tightened his grip on Rahman's arm, shoving him toward the back seat of the patrol car. "Wait," Rahman said, his patience thinning. "I am requesting to know the charge. Under the law, you must." Miller cut him off. "Suspicious activity. You were driving erratically. Possible DUI." Rahman's brows furrowed. "That's a lie." Miller smirked. "Oh, were you watching yourself drive?" Rahman clenched his jaw. His car hadn't so much as swerved. There was no smell of alcohol on him, no slurred speech. The accusation was baseless, an excuse wrapped in authority. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't about a DUI. It wasn't about any actual crime. It was about power. Miller didn't see Judge Rahman. He didn't see a respected official, a man who had spent his life serving the very system Miller worked within. He only saw a middle-aged, brown-skinned man in an expensive car, driving through the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time of night. And that was enough. Rahman's breath came slow and steady, but his heart pounded with frustration. He had spent years lecturing young law students, reminding them of the dangers of implicit bias. But no lecture, no training, no courtroom debate could stop what was happening to him now. Miller pushed him into the back of the patrol car, slamming the door shut before Rahman could protest further. The interior smelled of stale sweat and regret, the kind of scent that clung to people who had spent their nights pleading their innocence to deaf ears. Through the mesh partition, Rahman watched as Miller leaned against the hood of the car, flipping through his paperwork with disinterest. "He's not even checking my ID." Rahman's mind raced. He had encountered officers like Miller before, men who thrived off control, who saw their badge not as a symbol of duty, but as a weapon. The weight of the handcuffs dug into his wrists. He tested their grip, flexing his fingers. There was no give. This can't be happening. And yet it was. Miller walked back to his squad car, speaking into his radio. Rahman couldn't make out the full conversation, but he caught fragments. "Brought him in. Possible resistance. Needs processing." Resistance. Rahman's frustration surged. He had complied with every order. He had spoken calmly. And yet, even now, Miller was rewriting reality to fit his own version of events. A deep sense of helplessness settled over him. He had seen how this played out for others. Arrest records, even if charges were dropped, left stains on a person's life. A mugshot, even for an innocent man, could haunt careers. Would the press get wind of this? Would tomorrow's headlines read, "Judge arrested in DUI scandal"? Even a single night behind bars could unravel decades of work. No, he couldn't allow that. Summoning his breath, he spoke again, loud enough for Miller to hear. "I need to make a phone call." Miller didn't answer. Rahman raised his voice. "I know my rights. I demand a phone call." Miller finally turned, walking back toward the squad car. He leaned down, resting his arm on the open window. His expression was smug, as if daring Rahman to try something. "You'll get your call. Down at the station. Then take me there," Rahman said coolly. Miller's smirk wavered for a second, as if surprised by the lack of panic in Rahman's voice. "You in a rush to get booked?" Rahman met his gaze, unwavering. "I want my phone call, officer. Now." Miller stared at him, then shook his head with a chuckle. "All right, Judge. Have it your way." He slammed the door shut and climbed into the front seat. The car rumbled to life, pulling away from the curb and heading toward the police precinct. Rahman sat in silence, his mind already working through his next move. He would call his clerk, his colleagues, whoever was necessary. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about a system that needed to be held accountable. And before the night was over, Officer Miller would realize just who he had put in those handcuffs. The weight of injustice. The patrol car rumbled through the city streets, the neon lights of storefronts and flickering street lamps casting eerie shadows across the dashboard. Judge Adam Rahman sat stiffly in the back seat, the cold bite of the handcuffs numbing his wrists. The metal partition between him and Officer Miller felt like more than a physical barrier. It was a symbol of the divide between them. One man had spent his life ensuring justice was served, while the other had just trampled it underfoot. The station was still a few minutes away. Rahman's mind worked methodically, analyzing every possible scenario. He had no doubt that once the truth came to light, this would turn into a scandal. But how far would Miller push this before that happened? Would he fabricate charges? Would he try to force a false confession? Rahman knew the system well enough to understand its cracks, the places where men like Miller exploited their power unchecked. But what Miller didn't know was that Rahman was not a man easily broken. The car jolted to a stop at a red light. Miller, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, glanced at Rahman in the rearview mirror. "You know," Miller said, a smug edge in his voice, "most guys in your position start begging by now." Rahman met his gaze in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "Most guys in my position don't have decades of legal expertise. You've already violated multiple laws, Officer Miller. I hope you're prepared for what comes next." Miller chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, you think because you know some fancy legal jargon, you're gonna scare me?" "No," Rahman said evenly. "I think because you just unlawfully detained a sitting judge, your career is about to be over." The smile on Miller's face faltered, but only for a fraction of a second. He masked it quickly, scoffing as if the idea was ridiculous. But Rahman had spent years reading people, watching liars squirm in the courtroom. Miller might have been good at intimidating others, but he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. Still, the officer doubled down. "A judge, huh?" he sneered. "You expect me to believe that?" Rahman sighed. "You never even looked at my identification, did you?" Silence. Rahman's patience, though vast, was beginning to thin. "Let's suppose for a moment that I am lying, Officer Miller. That I'm just some random guy making up stories. The moment we arrive at the station, they'll run my prints. You'll find out exactly who I am, and by then, the damage will be done." Miller's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Here's what's going to happen," Rahman continued, his voice unwavering. "You will let me make my phone call the moment we get to the station, as required by law. You will not alter my statement, and you will not tamper with evidence." Miller let out a dry laugh. "And what if I do?" Rahman tilted his head, his eyes sharp. "Then I will ensure that the lawsuit bearing your name is the first thing you see for the next several years." The light turned green. Miller hesitated for a moment before pressing his foot down on the accelerator. "You talk a big game," he muttered. Rahman said nothing. He didn't need to. The law would speak for him. The station, the precinct, was an old building, worn from years of too many arrests and too little accountability. The moment they pulled up, Miller exited the vehicle and walked around to yank Rahman out. He didn't resist, though every fiber of his being wanted to. He kept his composure, knowing that every move he made could be twisted against him. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the intake area. A few officers milled about, barely glancing at Rahman, as Miller led him to the booking desk. The sergeant on duty, a grizzled man in his late 50s, barely lifted his head from his paperwork. "Another one?" he asked, his voice devoid of interest. "Possible DUI," Miller said. Rahman let out a sharp breath through his nose. "You have no evidence of intoxication, Officer Miller." The sergeant finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. He took in Rahman's attire, his pressed dress shirt, his expensive watch, the confidence in his posture. Something didn't add up. "You run his ID?" the sergeant asked. Miller hesitated. The sergeant sighed and motioned for the officer at the desk to scan Rahman's fingerprints. As the machine processed his identity, Rahman watched Miller shift uncomfortably. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The officer at the desk frowned at the screen. His eyes flicked to Rahman, then to Miller. "You brought in Judge Adam Rahman?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. The entire room seemed to freeze. Officers who had previously paid no attention suddenly turned, murmuring among themselves. Miller stiffened. "That's not possible." The desk officer turned the monitor toward him. "It's right here. Chief Judge for the State Supreme Court." The sergeant's face darkened. He stood up, fixing Miller with a hard glare. "You arrested a sitting judge without cause." Miller swallowed, his bravado crumbling. He was acting suspicious. The sergeant cut him off. "Shut up." He turned to Rahman, his posture shifting from indifference to alarm. "Your Honor, I deeply apologize." Rahman lifted a hand, silencing him. "I will be making my phone call now." "Of course," the sergeant said quickly. "Right away." Miller's face had lost all color. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Rahman turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Officer Miller, I strongly suggest you remain silent. You've done enough damage for one night." Miller's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. As Rahman was led to a phone, the weight of what had just happened sank in. This was bigger than just him. This was about every innocent man or woman who had ever been pulled over without cause. Every person who had been silenced under the assumption that their voice didn't matter. He dialed the number of his colleague at the courthouse. "Daniel," he said when the man picked up, "I need you to prepare a statement. The press is going to want to hear about this." And before the night was over, they would. The scales of justice tipped. The precinct was no longer just a police station. It was a crime scene. Not in the literal sense, but in a way that Judge Adam Rahman understood all too well. It was the scene of a systemic failure, a moment that laid bare the flaws in the very institution sworn to uphold justice. As he hung up the phone, the air in the station grew thick with tension. The sergeant had already made several frantic calls, and within minutes, the precinct was abuzz with murmurs. Officers glanced at him with expressions ranging from confusion to panic. Some looked ashamed. Others, like Miller, simply radiated fear. Rahman turned, his sharp eyes landing on Officer Miller, who had taken a few cautious steps away from the booking desk, as if hoping to disappear into the background. "Sergeant," Rahman said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had passed sentences on criminals far more dangerous than the one who stood before him now, "I expect this officer to be placed on administrative leave immediately, pending a full investigation." The sergeant's face twitched. He had likely been in the game long enough to know that the fallout from this would be massive. With one misstep, his own career could become collateral damage. "Of course, Your Honor," the sergeant said quickly, turning to Miller. "Hand over your badge and gun, officer." Miller's eyes widened in shock. "Wait, what?" "You heard me," the sergeant said, his voice firm. "I can't have you out in the field after a mistake like this. The chief will have my head." Miller's mouth opened and closed, his mind scrambling for an argument, but none came. He hesitated before unhooking his badge and firearm, placing them on the desk with reluctant movements. "This is ridiculous," Miller finally muttered. Rahman turned to him, his gaze cool. "No, Officer Miller. What's ridiculous is that you felt emboldened enough to act as judge, jury, and executioner tonight. What's ridiculous is that you dismissed my rights because, in your mind, I didn't fit the profile of someone who belonged behind the wheel of a luxury car in this part of town." Miller's face burned red, but he didn't respond. He knew there was nothing he could say that would erase the damage he had done. The tension in the room deepened when the main doors of the precinct burst open. Several figures stormed in, their presence commanding immediate attention. Among them was District Attorney Lisa Carter, her expression locked in a mask of barely concealed fury. Behind her trailed Chief of Police Marcus Reynolds, his uniform crisp, his jaw set like stone. He had the look of a man who had just been woken up in the middle of the night to deal with a disaster. "What the hell is going on here?" Chief Reynolds demanded. Raman, ever composed, took a step forward. "It appears, Chief, that one of your officers has made a grave mistake. I was unlawfully detained, falsely accused, and arrested without cause. And now, this precinct will have to answer for it." Reynolds exhaled sharply through his nose before his gaze landed on Miller, who had gone pale. "Tell me you didn't just arrest a judge without probable cause," the chief said, his voice dangerously low. Miller stammered, "Sir, he was acting suspicious. I thought." "You thought?" Reynolds snapped. "You didn't check his ID. You didn't confirm anything before escalating." Miller shrank under the scrutiny. DA Carter folded her arms. "This is going to be a massive problem, Chief, not just for your department, but for the city. The public is going to demand answers." Reynolds rubbed his temple. "I assume you'll be filing a formal complaint, Your Honor." Raman met his gaze evenly. "No," he said. The room went silent. Miller's shoulders sagged in relief, but Raman wasn't finished. "I won't be filing a complaint," he continued, "because I will be filing a civil rights lawsuit against this department. I will also be demanding an internal audit of every case this officer has ever been involved in. If this is how he treats an innocent man, I have no doubt there are others who have suffered worse." Miller's relief vanished in an instant. DA Carter nodded approvingly. "I'll be launching my own independent review as well. If we find any evidence of misconduct or wrongful arrests, charges will be filed." Miller swallowed hard. This is my career." Raman's expression remained firm. "No, Officer Miller. This was your choice, and choices have consequences." The weight of those words settled over the entire room. The press storm. An hour later, Raman exited the precinct, flanked by DA Carter and Chief Reynolds. The moment they stepped outside, the flashing of cameras and the roar of reporters filled the air. The story had already spread like wildfire. "Your Honor, is it true that you were arrested without cause? Do you believe this was a case of racial profiling? What actions will you be taking against the department?" Raman raised his hands, and the reporters fell into an expectant hush. He took a slow breath before speaking. "Tonight, I experienced firsthand the kind of injustice that many citizens endure daily," he said. "The very system meant to protect the innocent instead treated me as a suspect, not because of what I did, but because of who they assumed I was. And if this can happen to me, a judge, then what happens to those who don't have a platform to fight back?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I am not here to vilify every officer in this city," Raman continued. "There are many who serve with integrity, who wear the badge with honor. But we cannot ignore the fact that the actions of a few can destroy the trust of many. This will not be swept under the rug. I will ensure that real reform takes place. And to those who have ever been silenced, who have ever been afraid to speak out against injustice, know that you are not alone." The reporters erupted with more questions, but Raman turned and walked away, leaving the statement to linger. Officer Miller's career was over, but more importantly, the conversation had begun. And this time, the system would not look away. Justice demands more than apologies. The weight of the night's events settled heavily on Judge Adam Raman's shoulders as he sat in his dimly lit study. The city skyline stretched beyond his window, the lights twinkling like distant stars, indifferent to the storm brewing below. His phone had not stopped buzzing since he left the precinct. Calls from reporters, civil rights activists, fellow judges, even politicians who suddenly found it convenient to voice their support. But none of it mattered. Not yet. Raman took a slow sip of his tea, the warmth barely cutting through the chill in his bones. He wasn't shaken because of fear. No, he had long since learned how to temper his emotions. What disturbed him was the sheer predictability of it all. How many others had been in his place? How many innocent people had been humiliated, arrested, or worse, without the privilege of a title to shield them? A sharp knock on his door broke his thoughts. He sighed, already knowing who it was. When he opened it, District Attorney Lisa Carter stood there, holding a thick file in one hand and a determined expression in the other. "Hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Rahman smirked. "You always are, but that's never stopped you before." Carter chuckled, but her face quickly hardened. "I have something you need to see." She dropped the file onto his desk and flipped it open. "We ran a preliminary review of Officer Miller's cases, and Adam, it's worse than we thought." Rahman's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. "How bad?" Carter exhaled sharply. Over the last 6 years, Miller has had 14 complaints filed against him, allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and unlawful stops. And guess what? Not a single one resulted in disciplinary action. Rahman's jaw clenched. Because the system protects its own. Exactly. She pulled out a few pages. It gets worse. Several of the people he arrested were wrongfully convicted. Minor charges stacked into felonies, plea deals forced under duress. I have at least 3 cases where the defendants insisted they were framed, but their claims were ignored. Rahman ran a hand down his face. "And I assume Miller isn't the only one." "Not even close." Carter's voice was grim. "We're looking at a systemic issue, Adam. A culture that allows officers like Miller to thrive. And if we don't act fast, this will get buried, like it always does." Rahman closed the file, his mind already racing. Then we don't give them a chance to bury it. The confrontation at City Hall. The next morning, City Hall was flooded with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens. The media frenzy over Rahman's wrongful arrest had ignited a firestorm, and public pressure was mounting. Inside the Grand Chamber, a panel of city officials, police representatives, and legal experts gathered for an emergency hearing. At the center of it all stood Police Chief Marcus Reynolds, flanked by a team of high-ranking officers. Rahman and Carter entered together, their presence shifting the energy in the room. The murmurs died down as the city council leader, an older man with thinning gray hair, cleared his throat. "We are here today to address the deeply troubling incident involving Judge Rahman's wrongful arrest," the council leader began, choosing his words carefully. "Chief Reynolds, the city demands an explanation." Reynolds adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable. "First, let me say that what happened to Judge Rahman was unacceptable. Officer Miller has been placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation, and we are reviewing our training policies." Rahman held up a hand. "Spare us the rehearsed apologies, Chief. This isn't just about me. It's about the system that allowed this to happen in the first place." Reynolds hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the cameras broadcasting the hearing live. "We acknowledge there are issues." "Issues," Carter interjected. "Chief, we found 14 complaints against Miller." 14. And yet, he was still patrolling the streets, making arrests, ruining lives. How many more officers like him are in your ranks? A murmur swept through the audience. Reynolds exhaled sharply. "We are committed to reviewing all prior cases." Rahman leaned forward, his voice unwavering. "Then let's make it official. I am demanding an independent oversight committee to investigate not only Officer Miller's cases, but the entire department's record on racial profiling and unlawful arrests." The room tensed. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "It's non-negotiable," Rahman said firmly. "The people deserve transparency, and justice demands more than apologies." A round of applause erupted from the audience. Some of the city council members nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. The council leader tapped his gavel. "We will take this matter under consideration." "No," Rahman cut in. "You'll take action, or I promise you, the people will make sure you do." The weight of his words settled over the chamber. This was no longer just about one wrongful arrest. It was about all of them. And this time, justice would not be denied.